When you were competing in 99 and then through the 2000s, early 2000s, what did that training look like? So how often did you train at your peak, would you say?
Every day. And I would only take a day off if I felt I needed one. There were times I trained for 10 days in a row. My goodness, it really pulled me in quickly. I'd feel a bit burnt out. I'd need a day off because I wasn't sleeping brilliantly and increase my calories a bit. And then I'd go and do another 10 days. And that's pretty much the pattern.
And that was contest prep, though, specifically for fat loss, yeah?
Yeah, combination of deficit with the diet, but also the volume. I would pick the volume up as well. So I'd just do more sets.
Was it very different than how you did things when you were trying to build muscle in that time as well in 99, early 2000s during your peak? That's an example of like contest prep. What about if your goal was muscle growth? How did that change or look?
It's an interesting one now because in my mid 20s, early to mid 20s, and I was trying to pack on size, I did try HIIT. I did use 1-2 sets per exercise and did forced reps and drop sets and all of that kind of stuff. And it does have a positive impact. You know, I did get bigger, but I also got fatter. Now, maybe I hadn't got the nutrition nailed at that point, but it wasn't a great look. So yeah, you know, with a t-shirt on and a pair of jeans on, I kind of looked bulky. When I got ready for that first show, I realized it all had to come off anyway. So it was better for me to change the way I trained. And during the early 2000s for contests, I very often trained antagonistic muscle groups, so chest and back, and I'd do alternates between chest movement, back movement, and delts and back, and bis and tris. And I'd do the same with legs. I'd squat and then do seated leg curls and just move backwards and forwards. And it's very metabolically stressful.
And you did that even during the time when your goal was muscle growth?
Yeah, I think I did. The difference was that I was just eating differently.
The loads were similar, like in terms of how much you were lifting?
Yeah. I didn't really lose much strength when I dieted until, you know, right at the end when you're getting pretty weak and overtrained. But I never got that much stronger either. So that was the peculiar thing. When I was eating more calories, sometimes carrying a bit more weight wasn't always the best thing for me. Staying a bit leaner kept me in a groove where I looked better, but also my strength didn't tail off that much because I wasn't hugely strong to start with. You know, the difference between being at my strongest and at my weakest wasn't like that.
So what inspired, would you say, that HIIT experiment? Because you mentioned you're friends with Ian. Was it because of him that rubbed off on you a little bit, or?
No, it was Dorian Yates. And the popularization of Mensa, and obviously Yates was a big name in the early 90s because that's when he won his Olympia title in 92 and 93 and on. Training partner and I thought we'd try it, and I got a bit stronger. I did, but I don't think it helped me overall. I think it probably didn't suit my skeleton. It didn't suit my physique, and I don't think my body responded to it as well as other styles of training.
And are you specifically referring to the progressive overload component of trying to either add load, add reps every workout, really high levels of intensity of effort? Which part was it specifically, do you think, that just wasn't meshing well for you?
Yeah, I think it's the constant overload by adding extra weight. I think finding other ways to create stress, time under tension, shorter rest periods, whilst keeping the poundages the same would elicit improvements. And I was able to make progress doing that rather than trying to add weight each week, which I've got a very light skeleton and I think my joints couldn't handle it very well. I used to end up sore, so elbows, wrists. I've not really had problems with knees, but lower back for sure. So, you know, could only load up to a point. And the other thing is, you know, with leg workouts as well, I know people had considerable poundages there. I've always responded to high reps. So I always kept my reps high, 15s, 20s, which means that the loads are going to be a bit lower than they would be if you were hitting a lower range of reps, if you were hitting 5s to 8s or even 10s.
You mentioned 65 kg is what you'd compete at, right? In your prime?
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
So when you were not competing, let's say you're in a phase where you're looking to put on some muscle, what did you sit at typically, weight-wise?
Right. Probably about 68, 70.
So not that far off.
No, It didn't take me long to get in shape. I think in my early 20s, I allowed myself to get fat, if I'm being honest, and thought that was getting bigger. So I would go up to maybe 75, 77 kilos, and it wasn't great. You know, maybe I was living in denial at that point about the amount of body fat that I was going to have to shift. But through learning the process and having better knowledge, I think I realized that staying closer to competition weight was the way to go because it was easier to take off the residual when competition time came in. There's just a kind of graininess in appearance and vascularity that improves each time you get low down. And if you can sustain that and you don't go too far over, there were times between 2000, 2003 when I wasn't competing, when people around me, would say, are you getting ready for a show? And no, I'm not. But I was that close. 10 weeks out, I could have stepped on stage.
I want to go back for the training because you mentioned about increasing the sets. The 1 to 2 wasn't really working for you based on what we just discussed with the HIIT experiment. So how did that transition and what inspired also the transition?
I think the inspiration for the transition was a recognition that higher volume would work in terms of dialing me in. So that was the motivation for that. A recognition that I didn't need as much cardio, because if I made the weights workouts demanding, ramping up the volume, that would pull me in, because metabolically it was harder on my system. It was just something I learned through trial and error. It's a little bit like, I'll give you an example, doing lots of cardio used to flatten my legs out, whereas doing squats or leg presses used to, I could probably exercise my legs twice, sometimes 3 times a week, but they would look physically, they would look better. They'd look fuller, rounder, they popped more, and I didn't need the cardio because the leg workouts themselves were very hard.
You would actually thrive on higher frequencies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. High frequency, higher volume. And when that was tuned to a diet where the calories were quite restricted, I was creating a deficit, a consistent deficit. It worked. It was potent in terms of fat burning.
Let's say it's not contest prep. Let's go back for a second, because you did have periods, what was it, like a few years between contests in some cases, right?
Yeah.
In those periods where your goal is, like, let's say you're sitting around 68 to 69 kg, like you spoke about, which would be typical in the off season.
Yeah.
So let's say that you're sitting around 68 to 69 kg. What did that training look like as far as frequency is concerned? So was it every day, like you mentioned, 10 days in a row sometimes, or was it a different approach at that point?
Maybe I'd take a few more rest days because of kind of my obsession with training. I'm pretty much the same these days. I mean, I'm training some weeks 6 times a week. It doesn't change. It's something I enjoy doing. So it might be 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, or it could be 3 on, 1 off. It was still quite high frequency. Experimented as well with different programs. So there were times when I trained upper lower body. So I might do 2 days back to back. I might do an upper body day and then legs and then have a rest and then repeat. So the turnover is 72 hours still per body part. And that is one of the most significant things I learned, I think, in preparing for competitions, that the way I trained in my early to mid 20s was maybe a body part a week. For me, that was an overcompensation. It always seemed like the muscle looked its best after 3 or 4 days recovery. And then I started to lose the size. So by the time, let's say I trained my legs once a week, they were great after 4 days. But by the time 7 days came around, I'd lost fitness and they'd lost an edge. It was almost like I'd gained something and lost something within the space of 7 days. So what I learned is that it's kind of dual factor, that I needed to train each body part more frequently. And I think I found a way of doing that at least twice a week for all body parts, sometimes 3 times a week if I was stringing workouts together. So there were occasions where I did upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower without breaks. So that's an even shorter rest period. That's like 48 hours. And there were times in 2004 where I squatted every other day. And of course, I understand that Olympic lifters squat maybe every other day, or people on powerlifting programs squat every other day. So this is not unheralded. It's just that I think, the highway knowledge around bodybuilding is you need to rest in order to grow. I just think that may be true for some people, and it may be true depending on the kind of anabolic environment that you're working with. But for me, as a natural training with moderate weights, I found that frequency was the thing that enabled me to look my best.
Maybe it was the influence of the moderate weights, because when we're talking about moderate weights for the listeners, you're talking about not doing maybe max effort 4 rep, 5 reps, 6 repetitions. No, you were doing between the 10 to 20 reps on most things, right?
Certainly that kind of range for legs.
Oh, okay.
For upper body, the range was probably between 5 and 10. Typically for back, I didn't very often add weight when I was doing pull-ups. I've tried that before, but again, I ended up with problems with my elbows and tendons, and I pretty much stuck to body weight pull-ups. So I'd maybe do 15 or 16 reps on the first set, and the reps would diminish with each subsequent set. But that was fine because that was my first movement. Let's say for back, I'd do bent over rows with a moderate weight. I'd use between 80 and 90 kilograms, something like that, and hit 6 to 8 reps with that probably.
So that's not exactly moderate for the upper body. It's pretty heavy, relatively speaking, of course, to the lower body stuff. But as far as like, let's say proximity to failure, what was your take on that after experimenting with the high intensity stuff? Were you still redlining it on certain exercises, or how was that?
I think like that red line. Yeah, I think I was always gassing out on legs, but I think, yeah, positive failure. The thing that shifted for me is that I did fewer drop sets. And because I had a tendency to train alone over time, so I started with training partners and then actually found that I was better off training alone because I could do it my way. I could choose my exercises. I could train at the time I wanted to train. I could move as quickly as I wanted to move in the gym. I didn't have to manage anybody's bad mood on a given day when I was in a deficit or anything like that. So I would just do what I wanted to do. And that suited me being solo. And I would just learn to move quickly between sets and use weights that were appropriate. And sometimes I would go a bit heavier and sometimes I would go a bit lighter depending on how I felt that day. So it became more instinctive.
And naturally speaking, if you're doing short rests, like say 30 seconds or 45 seconds, because you were implementing that even during the off season as well.
Yeah, but especially with some of the isolation movements and even now. So this morning on certain movements, I was maybe taking 45, 50 seconds, no more than that. On some of the bigger compound movements, the ones that are more taxing on your body, pull-ups, for example, for me this morning, I was maybe taking up to 90 seconds on the first few sets. But then when I went onto the machines, I moved more quickly.
Have you always done it like that for the most part after the HIIT experiment?
Yeah, as long as I can remember. It's been so many years. It's like you forget what you've done sometimes, but I think so.
When you got rid of the training partner?
I kind of got rid of the training partner in 1999, 2000. So I trained with people on and off at different points, friends, but not consistently when I was preparing for a show. I was very often in the gym when it opened, sometimes before it opened, and just getting on with it. When I was dieting for a show, is not being able to get on the kit that I needed to access. And if it meant getting up earlier to get there before anybody was there to get the squat bar or whatever I needed, I would do that.
I think everybody listening to this podcast can relate to that for sure. I know I certainly can. So nobody wants to be in a packed gym and you can't get the access to the equipment you want. It's a bit of a nightmare. Ian's got a pretty cool setup there at his house that comes in handy, and especially under certain occasions like contest prep, right?
And that's what I had. So in previous houses where I'd lived, I'd got commercial equipment in a large garage. I got a linear bearing leg press. I got a glute ham raise. I got a proper rack. Yeah, I mean, it was a gym at home. There were times I trained in that garage at 2 a.m. once before I flew out for the WMBF show. Trained at 5, 4 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock at night. I've trained all around the clock.
You don't have that gym set up anymore?
No, I moved and sold up and don't have a garage now, but I've got a pull-up bar and I've got a rack of Hex dumbbells and I've got a glute ham raise upstairs and just joined a gym again. So I'm getting to the gym a few times now a week as well as doing bits at home. So I've got the best of both right now.
So you kind of mix it between the house and the commercial gym?
Currently, because I have a bit more time to be able to do that. And interestingly, we were talking about busy gyms. I got to the gym this morning very early at 5:30 and it was pretty full.
Yeah. Oh man.
I was quite surprised how many people were exercising at that time of the morning.
That's pretty, maybe everybody's having that thought because that's pretty rough. You think, oh, I'm going to get up early. And then the only reason you got up early was for the empty gym. And then you don't even get that. So then you think, oh, that was a kind of a waste maybe when you could have just maybe gone a little bit later, unless you're going before work. So let's go back to the training. When we were talking about this failure stuff. So you mentioned positive failure where you'll get to a point where throughout the set where you can't complete another rep pretty much.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Yeah, I would push sets to that.
How many per exercise would you say you're doing that for?
Now?
Let's say during your peak first.
Oh, let me think. Well, I remember someone commenting back in 2014 when I was preparing for a show. They said, yeah, I just can't believe how much you do, the volume. So about 40 sets, I think, for a workout.
Oh, man. Yeah, so that is high for like, look, there's people listening right now that will be like, that's what I do. For sure. There's going to be a crowd of people. But yeah, it seems high, maybe compared to if you're thinking about failure, what that's associated with, which is the high intensity training, Dorian Yates, Menser, Arthur Jones, that type of thing, where it's only 1 to 2 sets, maybe 12 to 15 sets max per workout, right?
Yeah.
So you were doing way more than that per workout. You're doing 40.
Yeah, and I've heard those arguments recently, because I still kind of listen to different videos and what Dorian says about training, and he's obviously still communicating those messages to people. But I think someone like Sean Ray, I'm probably closer to that style of training. He moved around quickly, didn't rest for very long. The weights were more moderate, obviously, hugely heavier than anything I've ever used, but that kind of style, kind of bouncing along and keeping the pace up, is the style that I use, I think, in my training.
But typically it was like 40 sets a workout.
Never for legs. I couldn't do that many for legs. I used to get wiped out with, I don't know, up to about 20, I think. I might do 6 to 8 sets on a leg press. Again, 20 rep sets, if not more. To give you an idea, on a leg press, when I was getting ready for a show in 2014, 10 years ago now, I would maybe only use, it was 100 kilos a side on the leg press. So 5 plates, 5 20s. I was hitting like 30, 32 reps for a set. And, I might get that on one set, and then the second set, I might be down to 24 and then hit 20s. And then I might strip, if I've done 4 sets like that, I'd strip a plate off and then just rep out with 4 plates. You see, that's very light weights compared to what some people use, but my legs just responded to those moderate weights and high reps. I didn't get anything out of loading up to 8, 9 plates, 10 plates and squeezing out 5 reps, 6 reps. It just didn't do anything other than hurt myself. And the pauses that people take in between the reps, my reps were like constant, like pistons, just up and down, just smooth. So I wasn't locking out at the top, wasn't really pausing at the bottom. There was no pause at all. It was just kind of like that movement, constant movement, back and two, back and two.
That was because also you were doing high reps. I mean, if you were doing this pausing stuff and slowing it down so dramatically, relatively speaking to what you were just describing, heck, you'd be there for 5 hours in the gym, because it would take you so long to complete a set, right?
Yeah.
Especially a set of 30. Like, you imagine, right? It would take you like triple the amount of time or something like this, but you were kind of keeping a rhythm to it.
Yeah. I absolutely appreciate that it's not for everyone. It wouldn't suit everyone, but I think I found what worked for me and what suited my physique.
Disclaimer, folks, don't go and try Dean's routine. That's good. That's what it's about. It's about you, right? That's what we're trying to uncover, some of these details. Maybe there's something people can start to think about, question. Maybe they take something positive away from this, get inspired, motivated. That's more what it's about. There's not one way to go about this. People will start thinking, okay, how does a certain way mesh well with my personality? Maybe the way I'm doing things, I'm not really enjoying it well. But then they hear you say or talk about your approach and they think, I wonder if I maybe implement what he said. That makes sense. And then, they start to enjoy it again. Or, I mean, this is kind of what it's about. For those listening, maybe they're young, maybe they're not young, maybe they're older, and they're getting some reminders even, right, on certain things. Because it's very easy to get stuck in your own ways, right?
Absolutely. And I think I borrowed inspiration as well from the training approaches of sprinters, the training approaches of gymnasts, and they train every day. And they are doing explosive movements every day. And gymnasts are not having to rest a week to rest their biceps or the triceps. Those areas are under isometric tension, static holds on a daily basis if they're doing certain movements. So I think the body can withstand a lot. I think there was just certain highway knowledge around bodybuilding, and I think it was probably propagated through magazines. And again, that is told within a context of a specific anabolic environment, which goes unsaid, but is nevertheless going to make a difference in terms of recovery patterns and in terms of what the body can tolerate. So notwithstanding all of that, I think it made sense for me to do it that way.
So let's go back, upper lower. Would you say that was pretty much the arrangement you landed on, the split of how you did things that seemed very productive for you from a frequency standpoint? So you do full upper, full lower, full upper, full lower, but the rest was kind of getting manipulated based on the season kind of thing?
The upper lower worked well for some time in contest prep because it allowed me to keep the volume high. Because if I was working all parts of my upper body, invariably I ended up with 40-ish sets, working again alternates, chest back, or shoulders back, and then I'd end up doing bis and tris and then some ab work at the end. And before I knew it, 45, 50 minutes later, with short rest periods, I'd done 40 sets. That's a lot of work. That's a very dense workout. And that is tremendously metabolically impactful. I discovered that it worked because I was melting fat training that way.
That sounds like a lot like how the bodybuilders back even in the silver era were training, like Steve Reeves. I mean, these guys were pumping out 40 sets. And hey, we know that Steve Reeves claimed all natural, right? That was like a big thing, right? You know, you look at his physique and people who are in this natural bodybuilding thing, it's realistic that he was, right? You could look at it and be like, okay, that looks like it's fairly achievable during that time. Because also he wasn't getting shredded like the natural bodybuilders now. He wasn't as lean as you are, right? Or were.
He's plausible.
Right, because it was a different era too, and based on the education they had. But look, the workouts they were doing, I mean, shoot, this guy was pumping out like what you just described, he was doing back in the 50s, maybe more sets, I think, if you add up the amount of volume he was doing. And those full body workouts. He was in the gym for like 3 hours.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So 3-4 hours from what he described and put out there as far as the reading material, right? That sounds like how you are doing things or were doing things during your peak with the short rest periods and the loads of sets, right?
And I think I could express it simply. It was just about doing more work. I discovered that the work dialed me in really effectively.
And you found it beneficial even from a muscle gaining standpoint, correct?
Yeah, because I just looked better. It just seemed to accentuate my appearance. So lower body fat, didn't lose any tissue really to speak of. It just made me look full. It suited me, I think.
Do you remember the period, because I think everybody does, the period where, if you really think about it, where you put on the most amount of muscle? Like for me, it was like within like the first 2-3 years of productive training, I made a huge change in my physique. There was like this clear before and after where it was like 30 pounds of gain. A lot of it was fat, but then when you strip away the fat, you're like, okay, those newbie gains, if you will. Do you remember the period for yourself?
Yeah, probably between 19 and 22 years of age.
Yeah, that's about the same for me, actually.
Yeah, I was squatting the heaviest I've ever squatted. Although I'd had the long jump injury a few years before that, I got a young body and I was still getting away with squatting 3.5 plates for 15 reps. And I never went full squats at that point. I used to do halves, but my quads just responded really quickly to, again, I didn't go super low reps. I kept the reps up to 15. I used to warm up with a plate on each side for 15. I then put a second plate on and get another 15, and then I'd go straight to 3 plates and squat 15 and either keep it at that or add another 10 on each side and go to 3.5 and get 12 to 15. I think about that now and it makes me wince, thinking, my God, where was the warm up? Where was the careful increments? No, it was just like throwing on a 45-pound plate
Right.
on the way up to 3 plates. So I never squatted really big weights. I was never squatting, regularly 4-5 plates a side, which I see now on the internet. Some guys do, but the reps were pretty high with 3 plates, given that I was only, at that point, probably I was a bit heavier then, maybe 11.5, 11.10. So what would that be? 76 kilos, would it? 77 kilos.
Okay.
But with some fat, I wasn't lean at that point either. I was carrying body fat too.
Of course, then you stripped it down and you're, like you mentioned, the 68, 69 kg that was it for you and that you refined it. I'm sure it got better. That look got better over the years, that 68, 69 kg, right?
Yeah. It did. And I rarely went over 70k. To look any good, I was always under 70k. It didn't suit me. I started to look fatter when I got over 70k.
How tall are you?
5'4".
Ah, okay.
163.
Very understandable. Because you mentioned your job, just out of curiosity. You found that working out in the AM was the most productive for you for the most part, or is that what you just enjoy as well?
Well, yeah, I think the thing was, again, it's something I didn't do before I started competing. But when you compete, it used to mess my sleeping pattern up. So I was always awake early, always desperate for breakfast. It was like starving on a diet. I don't miss that at all. And therefore, getting to the gym as soon as it opened, there would be times I would be sitting waiting for the gym to open at 6:30 just to get in and get the workout done. And I could relax for the day once I'd done that. But the other point was that I wasn't really worth very much after 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I'd been awake half the night and I was dieting for a show and training first thing in the morning. So that was another reason for getting the workout and done.
That makes complete sense. Okay, so let's start with your contest history. How long you've been competing for, and then how long you were training before you started competing.
Okay, so I've been lifting weights for 40 years this August. I started lifting weights to supplement my athletics training. I started at 14 years of age. By the time I was kind of 21, 22, I was finding it difficult to